Ja, Mentakiapi. Apetuasti. It's January 6th, 2017. Tampawasti Mie. I am good moccasin. Ron Leaf is my English name, but you know. The last time we were together, I talked about corporate vampires. This time, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about spiritual empowerment. If you take a look at Standing Rock and the media's relationship to the events that have taken place in Cannonball, you'll see that journalism is kind of a cut and dried approach. Facts, figures, what have you. But I want to talk a little bit about what's not being reported, what's not being portrayed, what's not being illuminated in the press and the other stories. I wrote a little bit about this and sent my comments to some of the people there in Standing Rock. But it's the spiritual element of the camp, Ocheti Shikali, Oyate, the seven council fires of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota nations. That's where the real power lies, the strength, if you will. And when so many races get together with a single purpose in mind, you can have tremendous results. More prayer, more solidarity, more strength, etc. Well, lately, during the last, 30, 40 years maybe, there's been a huge movement in the country ever since the mid to late 60s called, it's being called New Age. A mixture of ancient traditions, philosophies, cultural lifestyles, etc. Well, I've never really seen it as a New Age type movement. I've always seen it as kind of old age because a lot of those traditions, yoga, Buddhism, the Tao, and a lot of Native American traditional lifestyles, all that mixture, all those foundations are thousands of years old. They're not new at all. I imagine they're new to some, fresh, But the one common thread that runs through all these different points of view, spiritual points of view, is the unvanquished strength, power, if you will, that the practitioners have maintained and solidified through the years and generation after generation practicing these life ways. If you look through history, do a little research, you can find a lot of information on all of these uh, cultural belief systems. But the one thing you won't find, or you'll find very little of, is indigenous spiritual practices. There are some men like James Mooney and women that have written a lot of material from their point of view on spiritual practices of Native people. Edward S. Curtis captured a lot of events. Sundance was photographed, sweats. A lot of ceremonies were photographed, recorded, if you will. But the essence, the center, the real heart and soul of these practices were never really exposed. Some of that was due to federal law. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, of course, kind of opened some doors in 1978, but a lot of practices were kept underground. Even though they were behind the curtain, you know, a lot of these practices still created legislation that were made to stifle, destroy, dismember those churches. I'll call them churches. That's what they were. That's what they are, rather. For instance, with the Native American church, the use of peyote in whatever form was illegalized. Several court cases, federal and state level, um, legislatures, politicians, businessmen, perhaps, tried to dismantle the church and dismantle its use of peyote as a sacrament and labeling it as a drug, etc. And of course, Sundance, Sweat Lodge, pipe ceremonies, Yuipi, all these other practices, Medewan. Um, you could go across the country and just list whatever spiritual practice you wanted to, and at some point there was federal prohibitions created to stifle those practices. But you look in Europe, the Middle East, Russia, China. Like I said, there's a lot of information. Anyone who considers themselves a researcher can go and find that information, with the exception of indigenous spiritual practices. Now, the reason why these practices have survived, and the reason why they've survived relatively untouched, unexplored, unexplained in some cases, is because the indigenous communities took it upon themselves as a sincere responsibility to serve and protect their particular lifestyles, lifeways, or Dakota Wichoha is what they say in my community, the way of life. And still to this day, there's a lot of information that hasn't been shared. And that information that has been shared has typically been misconstrued, which brings me back to Standing Rock. I've seen the stories coming out in the media, People magazine, Time magazine, etc., wherever, mass media, newspapers, New York Times, what have you. And they're very proficient about reporting the facts. What they don't report on is, of course, the spiritual foundation, the foundations of unity, brotherhood, faith, prayer. And the reason they don't report on those things is because they don't know anything about them. How do you report on something you know nothing about? So those types of stories, and that's what I wrote in my comments, those types of stories have not evolved. And so when the corporate bodies, the legislative bodies in North Dakota, the federal bodies, whomever they may be, when they take a snapshot of the Ochete Shakoa, the camp at Standing Rock, they can see everything except for the spirit. The spirit is unseen. And the spirit is the real strength. And, the system of decimation, annihilation, genocide, nationalized genocide in this country, and has a long, long history. They've been trying to get rid of us for over 500 years, and here we are. Of course, that's not to say that we haven't been knocked down a few times, because we have. And we've done some knocking down of our own. In 1968, when the American Indian movement was created in Minneapolis with men like George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, others, Vernon Belcourt, Bill Means, all these different warriors who stood in the front lines on behalf of the indigenous communities in the Northern Hemisphere. One of the very first tasks that they brought forward as a responsibility, assuming a responsibility, was the spiritual cohesion in the communities, ceremonies, prayer, belief systems, faith. They recognized that it was being under attack, and they knew who the attackers were. That's why they